Hello, and thank you very much for coming along. This evening we're going to look at what will global climate change mean for Boston. It's an open question, and it's a predictive question in some sense, but there's a great deal of learning and scholarship and research that's gone into it, and we want to look at some of that this evening. We've been told that we have a code red for humanity. A major UN report warns of climate catastrophe if urgent action is not taken. At the same time, there have been reports made locally for what these global changes are going to mean in areas like eastern Massachusetts, or in fact all of New England. Let's take a look. Well, we learned from the news that a lot of Americans are under heat stress this summer. You only need to go outside in Boston and realize this in the last few weeks. And Transition Studies carries these stories on a regular basis, so you can check in to any of the stories listed here with a kind of yellow border and get access to this through Transition Studies. 90 million Americans are under heat alerts. Scorching heat moves east. Well, we're used to having heat alerts from the American Southwest, and even in the farming zones in the Midwest. But as that moves east, it's very worrisome for populations in large urban concentrations like New York and Boston. Children cool off as dangerous heat strikes Boston, according to the Associated Press, on July 27th, 2022. It's going to be a scorching rest of the week in Massachusetts. These maps show how hot it will get, said an article in the Boston Globe. And you can get access to these maps now through an organization called the Southern New England Weather Outlook. The real question is, are you climate ready, Boston? Or for that matter, any of the coastal cities, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and internationally, London, Hong Kong, Lagos, Nigeria, Cairo. Are you climate ready? Well, this is the kind of question that's posed and then answered in these climate special reports, like the one, Climate Change Impacts and Projections for the Greater Boston Area, that has recently been published by UMass Boston. Are you climate ready? Well, let's take a look at it. This is the report that has come out, and it's really quite impressive. Climate Change Impacts and Projections for the Greater Boston Area by Ellen Douglas and Paul Kirshen. You can see from the title page that it's part of the findings of the Greater Boston Research Advisory Group. Very interesting group. Project leadership was under Ellen Douglas and Paul Kirshen, and they list their email addresses right there on the title page. Project administrator is Kimberly Starbuck. It's possible to get a copy of this report, this several hundred-page report, from the link on Transition Studies. It's emphasizing, as you can tell from the cover, 4 different areas, as it's seen on the bottom of the cover, very clearly having to do with something that's been experienced in the last few days. Heat stress, coastal vulnerability, very big issue in Massachusetts, flooding, inland flooding as well as coastal flooding, and then drought. These are the pictures available right from the get-go on their cover. right? The details inside are even more complicated, and they move into other areas as well than those summarized by these four on the top page. Heat stress Bostonians know about. On July 27th, the articles posted in Transition Studies, or reposted, I should say, from CBS Boston, clearly state Boston residents try to beat the heat. Coastal vulnerability is in the news all the time. This was from the Wall Street Journal back in 2018 about how Boston agonizes over how to protect itself from future storms because it was hit by several extraordinary storms that hit the seacoast. In fact, whole populations of Chelsea, Revere, and Winthrop are looking into how climate change impacts the most vulnerable populations in these areas. Down in the Cape, it's even more dramatic. When the clouds clear and the seas calm down, you can notice that a lot of the underpinnings of houses have disappeared because of coastal soil erosion. This house was built on a dune, but then the dune disappeared, completely washed away, as was the road. You can see people standing out here on the edge of what used to be a road that went through it. Well, guess what? Climate change is going to have an extreme impact on coastal vulnerability. What about flooding? Well, obviously, flooding in Boston is going to be a key issue in the years to come, decades to come, in fact, centuries to come. They say the coming years, but there's no indication that's going to be reversed within years. And the flooding is part of a series of concomitant events, heat waves, rising seas, and intensifying storms will pummel the Boston area, new report finds. Well, that's the report we've been talking about. Then drought. Well, as it turns out, once again, on July 11th, 2022, we learned that 75% of Massachusetts is in moderate drought. Once again, call up these stories from Transition Studies, just type in their title in the search engine and you can get to the stories. In this case, it's a YouTube story, so you can hear the report. Similarly, there are reports, in this case from Channel 5, on the 14th of July, about how Massachusetts drought is impacting growers. So it's not just the coastal areas that are being hit by extreme weather, sea level rise, and flooding problems. The drought to the interior is affecting everyone, including Massachusetts farmers. But it's not limited to farmers. Take a look. On the 26th of July, CBS Boston carried the story, which you can again view on Transition Studies by searching for the title. As drought continues, many Massachusetts communities enact water bans. Well, that's very interesting. It isn't just the, as it were, the farmers who are in trouble here, the growers, as it's referred to in the Channel 5 report, but since the water supply comes from rural areas, you'd expect that it would affect all people drawing water from reservoirs in the rural areas. And sure enough, communities are considering and enacting water bans as of the 26th of July. This is not ancient history. It's not projected into the future. It's happening now. It's part of what we get in touch with and keep in touch with through Transition Studies. Well, It's a global problem, not just a Massachusetts problem. And you can, in fact, through transition studies, see that there's been global commentary about this for over months, years, decades. Once again, transition studies can give you a brief glimpse into this literature. See what 3 degrees of global warming will look like, according to The Economist, published in London. Well, see how that relates to the report we've been referring to here about the Boston area. What about extreme weather problem? Extreme weather problem is about to express itself this year. They posed it as a question in the title of a story back in May. Extreme weather. What's to come this hurricane season? Click on the story and find out. The first day of the hurricane season is every year designated arbitrarily as June 1st. And the stories abound on this as well. June 1st, from the May to the June. And we learned from the Washington Post that the National Oceanic and Aeronautic Administration forecasts 7th straight busy Atlantic hurricane season. The idea of a busy hurricane season is somewhat troubling to those who've been flooded by hurricanes in the past. And Boston's quite vulnerable in this respect. But this is not the only kind of extreme weather we've been seeing. In December of last winter, 50 people were killed in the most severe tornado event in Kentucky's history. This is well on land, but it's extreme weather. And in fact, just this same week, this past week, up in Toronto, there's been a tornado that ripped through parts of Ontario. Now, we may be accustomed to seeing tornadoes in the American Midwest or corridors around Oklahoma, where they've been made famous, or now in Kentucky. But to see tornadoes popping up in Ontario, Canada, is a bit out of the ordinary. It's the kind of extreme weather that's becoming more prevalent. Okay, I get it, you say. Extreme weather can be generated from tropical heat, especially in the summers and in the hurricane, typhoon, tornado season. That's normal, you say. But what about severe weather in the cold season, in what we call the winter, in New England, in Boston? Well, that's the kind of problem that's been studied for years, once again, and courses, in fact, have been given in it. Harvard Extension School presented a course for more than a decade. In fact, 21 different semester courses in the summer schools and in the years between 2004 and 2017 on global climate change. Not global warming, global climate change as a world environmental crisis. This was the perspective presented at the time from Harvard. The Extension School is the school at Harvard that reaches out beyond the gates to the wider world, and people could log on to these courses internationally, and did. Thousands did. The courses were run from 2004 right through the summer school of 2016, 21 different courses, updated each one from the 6 months previous that was offered. Eventually, these things gave rise to a series of websites that are available for all to use, well beyond Harvard, and those are available to the public from now on. Climate-boston.tv, climate-boston.com, climate-boston.org, climate-boston.net, and climate-boston.info. All of these can be consulted openly on the web and have mainly YouTube information posted behind them. Okay, so what about severe weather in the cold season, in the winter? Well, it's funny you should ask. They had a look at this in the Harvard climate courses offered through the Extension School several years ago. I made a little synopsis of the problem, not just for Boston, but for cities along the East Coast. They called it Tracing the Past, Envisioning the Future, Mapping the Earth for Human Survival in a Climate-Changed World. Not just global warming, not just a heat wave in Boston, but a climate-changed world. Let's have a look. Hello, and thank you very much for coming along. This evening we want to look at the vulnerability of East Coast cities, and in particular New York and Boston, to events like we've just had. We've experienced a bit of a snowstorm here in the Northeast, and we're still digging out from it. It's not that severe, but it is characteristic of winter storms that are likely to become more pronounced in the coming years, and perhaps one of the least severe of what could become more dramatic in the coming years. So we want to think a little bit about how this relates to the larger picture on a global scale and what we can do about it in preparation. And particularly we want to look at what we can do to trace the past and envision the future. In some sense, we're up against it in a dramatic sense, that things are occurring in terms of transforming the entire global ecosystem at a much greater rate, faster pace, than any of us have been prepared to adapt to. And the reason for that is that in addition to changing weather patterns, we're seeing sea level change as well, simultaneously. So today we're going to look at tracing the past and envisioning the future, mapping the Earth for human survival in a climate-changed world. It's no longer a question of being able to avoid climate change. We are headed for it. The excessive release of carbon, either through the combustion of carbon fuel sources or the release of methane from the Earth itself, has accelerated the heat trapping capacity of the global atmosphere, trapping more heat closer to Earth and warming up the entire system. This means that the exchange system between water and land surfaces and between water and atmospheric surfaces, in a sense the sky above the oceans, has been accelerated because things are heating up. And hot air holds more moisture than dry air, and as a result it precipitates a great deal more, and a great deal more emphatically in areas where it drops the water. We've been seeing this somewhat dramatically with the extensive storms that have come up just this weekend
here in New England. And we consider it a bit of a pain, especially when we look at weather channel maps like this. The winter storm Helena, as it became known, mapped itself from the Carolinas right up through to Maine in a single swath of activity that had everyone, in a sense, tuned to their TVs for a little bit to see when it would hit here. And there are dramatic changes along very defined lines of whether it was rain out in the ocean, mixed sleet and rain, snow, and then heavier snow. Actually, this is the heavier snow part, and this is the lighter snow band behind it. But basically every coastal city on the east coast of the United States was affected from the Carolinas northwards. It's the extent of that storm, as well as the severity, that's of interest to us. The Weather Channel carried, of course, the usual projected maps of snowfall and how much would be 8 to 12 inches, 5 to 8 inches, 8 to 12 here around the Cape, 5 to 8 in the Boston area, and less out in Worcester, and even sort of up to 1 inch out in very western Massachusetts, into New York and Pennsylvania. Light dusting, as it were, out there, but a heavier dosage here closer to the coast. Now that pattern and that mapping is very important for enabling people to understand how they ought to behave, where they should drive, where they shouldn't drive, whether they should drive at all. And especially this boundary between freezing rain and snow itself. This is related, of course, to the history of storms, and there are some people who've looked into the history of storms on the East Coast in a very important way. They're called hurricane historians or forensic hurricanologists, people who look at, in effect, severe weather in its historical pattern. This particular case is from 1851 to 2010, but there's an expert down in New York on this who's interviewed every once in a while.
In 1995, when I went to the city and made them aware of the hurricane problem based on the history of New York, the media picked it up and called me Dr. Doom. A few years ago, somebody asked me, do they still call you Dr. Doom? I said, no, they're calling me quite often now. The scope of devastation of Sandy surprised even me. And that was simply because the jet stream got involved and the tremendous thermal difference between snow in the Appalachians and a hurricane that was riding the Gulf Stream caused a 1,000-mile tropical monster. Add to that, you have the most built-up and populated coastal segment in the United States at risk. And you have people that don't believe it can happen. And until Sandy, they really didn't believe it could happen until we discovered that hurricanes had been hitting the Northeast since 1635. And you can never argue with history. It's there.
You can never argue with history. It's there. Since 1635, he said. Well, he's actually gone back and studied the sediments left off the coastal areas as a result of the outwash of these storms, and he discovered that in 1635, 1 year before Harvard was established, there was an extraordinary storm that hit the east coast of the United States and devastated the indigenous populations with, in addition to the plagues they were experiencing. Dr. Nicholas Koch, keep in touch with what he does. It's pretty extraordinary. Take a look.
We must not consider frequency alone in dealing with natural disasters, but also consider the consequences. This is the Big Apple. Anything that happens appears multiplied in costs and dislocation. The economic aspects of Sandy are not really realized. We got a rat infestation, We got people that lost their jobs. We got companies that went out of business. We have millions of dollars in lost revenue from entertainment and restaurants. We have massive infrastructure costs. If you pull that all together, it is frightening. The mitigation efforts are far less costly than the recovery efforts would be. The fact that we haven't taken zoning seriously was the major factor in the loss of life in these areas that should never, ever have been built on. Recovery is for fixing up the houses that were destroyed. Those houses will be destroyed again. Is this the proper use of that money, or should we put it to buying out the houses and getting people out of the hazardous zones? For the next century, you should be at least 500 feet away from the shoreline, preferably more. America needs a strategic approach to the handling of natural disasters. The major proposal, which is in the tens of billions of dollars, is to build a series of gates across New York Harbor. There are far more effective and cheaper things that should be done immediately. We're getting near the limit of our original building in some of the older areas. And unless we raise those structures, we build flood walls, we protect our subways, we protect our tunnels, we're in for a serious business and location. Global warming is a reality. And with global warming comes the melting of our polar ice caps, raising sea level. That means that every storm in the future is going to do progressively more damage. Well, if the ocean is warming, that means that more hurricanes can use that warmth to penetrate up here. It's very clear that we're on a path to disaster unless we realize it and spend the proper efforts and money to protect our people in the future.
Okay, you can't get much clearer than that. And he's been saying it now for about a decade. Every time the news story turns their attention to an extreme weather event, they call him up.
And joining us now is Dr. Nicholas K. Koch. He's a coastal geologist at Queens College of the City University of New York. Sir, good morning to you.
Yeah, thank you.
It has been how long since New York has seen something like this?
Oh, quite a few years, but this is a replay of a hurricane that hit New York City in 1821.
1821.
And it literally hit every city at that time on the way up. I never thought that would happen again. And when it hit New York City, the tide rose 13 feet in 1 hour.
Now, that's pretty extraordinary, right? Here's a gentleman who studied this to the point of being able to figure out how many feet it rose in an hour in 1821, right? And it isn't unrelated to the current pattern of storms because it hit every city on the way up the coast. Just like this one hit over the weekend. Every city from North Carolina right up through Portland, Maine. The magnitude of this storm was nowhere near the 1821 storm. But we have to start taking seriously the tracing of the past storms. And coastal geologists like this are in hot demand at this point, with good reason, because they know how to map what we're about to face.
And joining us now is Dr. Nicholas K. Koch. He's a coastal geologist at Queens College of the City University of New York. Sir, good morning to you.
Yeah, thank you.
It has been how long since New York has seen something like this?
Oh, quite a few years, but this is a replay of a hurricane that hit New York City in 1821.
1821.
And it literally hit every city at that time on the way up. I never thought that would happen again. And when it hit New York City, the tide rose 13 feet in 1 hour.
Of course, the predictive models were slightly less accurate
Right.
in 1821. So what do we have to do right now?
Stay away from the water and get yourself in a wind-resistant building.
Okay, now that's the advice when the hurricane is outside, right? But he's to be taken far more seriously in terms of the projection of what's likely to come. Take a look.
We can see the additional problems that a catastrophe brings in an urban environment versus a more rural environment.
120,000 cars pass through the Lincoln Tunnel every day. There are 7 million daily subway riders. They may not be able to get out. In the event of a weekday mega hurricane, Manhattan could become a waterlogged prison.
The challenge for us is that there's never been an evacuation of really any kind in the city of New York.
Police, fire, FEMA, Coast Guard. The city calls for all hands on deck. By 1 a.m. on the day of the storm, the National Hurricane Center will put out a hurricane warning for the northeast coast.
In this area, hurricanes tend to be very fast-moving. So a storm could look like it's not headed toward the northeast and then suddenly make a turn and quickly start moving in our direction.
It doesn't seem possible that this fortress of marble and steel could be vulnerable to wind and rain. But it is.
According to our estimates, the two cities or the two metropolitan areas along the U.S. coastline where we could see total economic damages in excess of $250 billion from a hurricane are Miami and New York.
And there are really two separate factors. One is the nature of the hurricane that'll be hitting. That's the northern hurricane that moves 2 to 3 times faster and is immense in size. Then there's the nature of the area. We have a very gentle continental shelf which allows us to build up huge amounts of surge level.
The area most vulnerable to that storm surge is in the right angle formed by the shorelines of New Jersey and New York. This region is known as the New York Bight.
When you have a right angle like this, and you have a hurricane rotating counterclockwise, it's pushing water into that right angle, and there's no place for it to go. So it pours into Jamaica Bay, and it pours into New York Harbor to abnormally high heights.
Abnormally high heights. Now you can ask yourself, if this is going to be the new normal, superstorms, higher tides, and rising seas, what's that going to do for the Boston area? Well, guess what? They have a right angle down here, but we've got a whole scoop in the Bay Area from Cape Cod. And when a counterclockwise hurricane hits here, guess what? We're in real trouble, as they've shown us at MIT.
Here in Boston, we have some very interesting weather risks, thanks to the fact that we're located between the cold interior of Canada and the very warm waters of the Gulf Stream. We have some of the strongest temperature gradients on the planet. This is why we have such phenomenal weather, like last winter's blizzards, and also why we get the occasional hurricane, and even more worrying than straight hurricanes are what we call extratropical transitioning storms. Those are hurricanes that gang up with winter storms, create mayhem.
Okay, extratropical transition storms. Hurricanes that gang up with winter storms. It's these winter storms that make Boston far more vulnerable than any other place in the East Coast. Take a look at the assessment of a public health specialist.
I've had considerable experience observing wind and water disasters and studying them closely. Whether it's Bangladesh or the Indus River floods in Pakistan or Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, there are a number of principles that we need to bear in mind when you think about disaster response. A really significant hurricane nor'easter might well bring a storm surge of 20 feet into downtown Boston and into the low-lying areas along the southern coast and the northern coast. This would affect hundreds of thousands of people. The issue of warning, which would be paramount in terms of protecting populations, is significant here because Boston does not like to move. We have seen this in previous hurricanes and northeasters. People want to stay home and sit it out, and they think they're tough. They are tough, but a really significant storm surge is going to overwhelm their coping capacities, and they will need to leave. They will delay. That is usually the problem we see in all of these city storms in the United States. They will delay Boston more than other areas perhaps. And by the time they get the warning that they really have to leave, this is a significant, big one, there are two problems. The electricity might be out, so they will not get that warning. Or when they do decide they have to leave, it will be in a matter of hours before the full force of the storm is upon them, and they will either be trapped as they try to get out, or they will be caught in significant traffic. We've seen the problems with Boston transportation this past winter. There is not simply a robust enough public transport grid to allow low-income people to take public transport out of the city. It doesn't go out of the city. And the second problem is that the roadways are going to be totally jammed with cars and trucks as people try to get out on the meager and fragmenting infrastructure that now represents the hubs out of Boston. So the scenario I would say is that people are going to be caught in their homes in freezing high water and perhaps snow. They will be caught on the highways in freezing storm and high water, and they will be in that situation in darkness and without food and water until the storm subsides. Then there will be a tremendous problem of getting back if they have tried to evacuate, or trying to stay out of the cold, icy waters if they stayed in their homes. We're going to be dealing with a loss of power of all utilities across this section of Boston and inland, but definitely hitting the north and the southern coastal areas as well, that could last for up to weeks. The other big issue is going to be food supply and heat. The food will be rapidly consumed in the retail settings that still have it, and then the resupply to the Boston area will be encumbered by snow, subflooding, and the problems of getting big trucks into Boston to retail areas of distribution. So my sense is that Boston is prepared for many disasters, but the population is not prepared, is not adequately educated about the impending fast danger of a major northeaster storm surge, snow and ice, and then the long tail afterwards that will require considerable self-sufficiency.
Okay, we're not prepared for the winter storm in particular, and it's that winter storm, the combination of a winter storm and the extratropical hurricanes that Kerry Emanuel referred to, that we're in trouble for. Enormously vulnerable, not only to the storm itself, but to the surge afterwards, and then all of the infrastructure collapse that will occur because we don't have it very well in place. If it overtops the dam on the Charles River, all of this is going to be flooded area. We've talked about this before, and Boston has actually put together a research advisory group called DROUGHT to look at this, and they're trying to think about climate-ready Boston. Climate change and sea level rise projections for Boston have been made, and one of them has just been underscored by the fact this last week of further destabilization of the ice shelves in Antarctica. Now, this doesn't seem like it's very immediate to Boston. It's not, except that if this ice breaks up and further ice comes from the continent in South Antarctica into the sea level is going to be rising at a much faster rate than we thought.
Antarctica, the world's greatest freezer, is melting. Trillions of gallons are draining into the oceans. Sea levels are rising. It's happened before, and it's happening again, right now.
It's not a question of will sea level rise a large amount. It's only a question of how fast that will occur.
Only a question of how fast that will occur. Well, apparently it's occurring much faster than anyone predicted. The groups over in Boston are looking at this. The Beacon Hill seminars held a seminar called Earth's Changing Climate, What is Causing It and What It Will Mean for You. And we need to start tracing the past in order to map the future and envision what that future is going to be with experts like Dr. Nicholas Koch and Jennifer Leaning. We basically need to develop a new kind of citizen science alliance around the world in order to act together for a sustainable future. Harvard's teaching a course on it in 2 weeks' time.